Some historians think that this is the beginning of the Cold War. On March 12, 1947, President Harry Truman had a speech and announced his doctrine. Truman announced in the speech that the USA would support Greece and Turkey with economic and military aid. He did this in order to stop the Soviets from taking them. This would lead them to becoming communist, and that would leave a huge impact to that region. Britain could no longer help support the Greek government due to them becoming bankrupt after the war. The Greeks depended on the British aid, but now they were being covered by the Americans. The USSR wanted to put what Churchill called the Iron Curtain around the USSR so that any country near the border needed to have a loyal communist government. And in 1946, Greece tried to take over their government. They started a communist revolution and got support from the USSR. Because of this, Truman decided to create the Truman Doctrine. He didn't actually state the USSR in the doctrine. He stated the policy of the United States to support the free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The Congress decided to spend $400 million to help with the economic and military aid. The USA was afraid that the Soviets would be getting closer to the oil fields in the Middle East. Greece and Turkey then became members of NATO, so if the USSR attacked them, it would be as if it was an attack on all of NATO. And the purpose of the Truman Doctrine was basically to stop the spread of communism. It was very successful in preventing Greece and Turkey from becoming communist, but it didn't stop China from eventually becoming communist. By the end of World War II, much of Europe was devastated. Sustained aerial bombardment during the war had badly damaged most major cities and industrial facilities. Millions were in refugee camps living on aid from United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Food shortages were severe. The only major powers whose infrastructure hadn't been significantly harmed in World War II were the US and Canada. They were much more prosperous than before the war, as exports were a small factor in their economy. The Marshall Plan was the American initiative to aid Europe, in which the United States gave economical support to help rebuild Europe and stop the spread of communism. The goal was to rebuild, remove trade barriers, modernize industry, and make Europe prosperous once again. This plan was also offered to the Soviet Union and its allies, but they did not accept it, as to do so would be to allow a degree of U.S. control over the communist economies. The U.S. gave $15 billion to help recovering countries. The plan looked to the future and didn't focus on the destruction caused by the war, but in 1951, the plan was replaced by the Mutual Security Plan. After World War II, the US and the USSR occupied much of Europe. With Europe in shambles after the war, the two superpowers were tasked with forming new governments for most of Europe. Though they both promised to offer free elections, The US formed democratic republics, while the Soviets formed communist governments, much like themselves. The Soviets also supported communist coups and revolutions all over Europe, such as in Turkey, Greece, and Czechoslovakia, though only the one in Czechoslovakia succeeded. Scared by the threat of communism, Western European nations signed the Brussels Treaty that defensively linked England, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The red tide sweeping through Europe started to worry the Western powers. As a result, on April 4, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short, was formed according to the UN Charter. 12 nations joined in on the formation, including Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United States. These nations sought to stop the Soviets from expanding deeper into Europe and agreed to defend one another in the case of a Soviet attack. In the December of 1950, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed as the Supreme Commander of NATO military forces, with a unified command of 50 combat divisions. In the first couple years of its formation, it became clear that some changes would have to be made to prevent something like the Korean War from happening again. After the Warsaw Pact was established, NATO made it clear that in the case of an attack, they would respond immediately with nuclear weapons. Today, the NATO treaty is still in effect and now boasts a membership of 28 countries. And since communism in Europe has basically been eradicated, it can be said that NATO did complete its goals.